Welcome to the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Right now, we're going through the entire Bible to understand it as one big, cohesive story. We're covering one book each day, and this one's about 1 Corinthians.
The book of 1 Corinthians is a letter written by the Apostle Paul to a church that he helped found in Corinth. And the occasion of the writing of this letter is that everything is horrible. The church has gone off the rails, and any way they can think of to screw things up, they have thought of. Now, you might be tempted, along with me, to be like, stupid other people always getting things wrong. How can they not know better? But then you step back and you think about it for a minute, and it becomes pretty easy to cut these folks some slack and to want to be patient with them. I mean, think about how this church in Corinth happened. Paul shows up there. He stays with them for a very long time because people are hearing about the message of Jesus, and it's awesome. They're even seeing miraculous stuff, and their minds are changed, their hearts are changed, but also they don't know how to do church. They don't have a Bible yet, no New Testament at least, and they're deeply rooted in the culture that they've been a part of forever. There's no template for what church looks like yet. This is brand new territory for these people. So Paul is an interesting character in terms of how he relates to these churches he helped found, because on the one hand, he's like a friendly spiritual father to all these people, and he's patient, and he explains things again and again. In fact, this whole middle section of the New Testament, this is made up mostly of letters. The fancy term for these is epistles. But these letters are written from Paul to churches that he cares about, and there's usually a reason that he's writing them. Maybe there's a theology question that came up. Maybe somebody made a big mistake. Maybe there's a culture problem within the church. Maybe there's a culture problem in the larger world, and the church doesn't know what to do with it. Well, Paul weighs back in and gives guidance. So on the one hand, Paul is very invested and very patient. On the other hand, Paul has expectations because, like he said to the Romans, hey, you have a new heart. You have been regenerated and given new life, and you're choosing willfully to act in ways that are consistent with the old life, and you shouldn't be doing that anymore. In this letter that he's writing to the Corinthian church, there's all kinds of immorality and busted up, unjust, gross stuff going on that just isn't going to work. The church isn't going to hold if people keep living the way and thinking the way and treating each other the way they are. And so Paul comes along and he's like, hey, the antidote to all of your really ugly behavior is for you to better understand the message of Jesus, the work of Jesus, the gospel of Jesus, and for you to let it inform your life. In all these letters, you get kind of the two versions of Paul that I was talking about a second ago. You get the fatherly, patient version of Paul, but you also get the disciplinarian father who's like, hey, nobody else is going to come along and be able to speak into your life and prompt you toward what this is supposed to look like as Christians in Christ's church. So I'm going to do that, even if at times it is unpleasant and a bit confrontational. And to be totally honest, 1 Corinthians is at times a bit unpleasant and quite confrontational because Paul is getting after people he's invested in deeply, and he's getting after people who agreed to have Paul be the person who could speak into their lives like that. Well, Corinth, first of all, just as a city, stacks the deck against these fledgling Christians because the culture there is a broken mess. Corinth was an ancient world adjective. I mean, for something to be Corinthian meant that it was a moral dumpster fire. It was debauched. It was a port city that sits on this little narrow isthmus that divides Greece in half. And for centuries, people had found it more convenient to empty their boats, put them up on logs, and portage their ships across that narrow little isthmus of Corinth than it was to sail all the way around. So you got a whole bunch of outsiders. You've got all kinds of accommodations for these swarthy sailors who are inland for a day or two, working their butts off to move these ships. And in addition to those conditions that made things a little bit rough and tumble in this neck of the woods, you also had a patron deity in ancient Corinth, and their patron goddess is Aphrodite, it's the goddess of love. Weird, debauched sex stuff was baked into the culture, even the religion of Corinth, and had been for a really long time. In light of all of that, it was surely no surprise to Paul that he was going to have this conversation. He had to know that Corinth was something of a time bomb and that there would be a lot to overcome here culturally. And so in keeping with that, he writes a letter that goes point by point through 5 big issues that are causing damage and disunity in the church. So the letter is basically divided into these 5 sections that all start with Paul very descriptively explaining what is going wrong with specifics and talking about why it's wrong and damaging and problematic. And then the solution that he offers is always a reorientation in light of the gospel, who Jesus is, what the values of the kingdom are, and what the mission and the reason for the existence of the church in Corinth is. In part 1, he talks about factions and infighting. He talks about Christians suing other people and airing all of their dirty laundry in front of everybody using a secular Roman court instead of being bound together by the love of Christ to work things out together. In that section, he also talks about how there's this weird Christian celebrity worship thing that is happening and the grossness of that, the laughability of that even. And Paul, of course, points back to Christ as king of the entire church and tries to reorient the Corinthians in light of that. In part 2, Paul addresses the sexual chaos that was going on in Corinth. And look, my friends, quick aside here, there's no two ways about it. Sex is a beautiful aspect of life in terms of intimacy and the deepest levels of connectedness and emotion. And it's also a really easy one to screw up with the body and with the mind and the emotions. It's the kind of thing that people might get wrong at some point in their life, externally or internally. And I am not the ultimate judge of people I sit around and have a conversation with on the internet. Paul, on the other hand, was in a position where he was a spiritual father to these people. He knew them in person. He knew what their weaknesses were and their strengths were. And effectively, they had asked him to speak into their lives on this thing. They all knew there was a chance that this was going to be a difficult thing given the culture that they were a part of. And Paul speaks to it very boldly and very specifically. He calls out Corinthian cultural norms that were totally accepted societally, but that were wildly unhealthy and destructive. And of course, people didn't want to hear it for all of the reasons I just talked about and even more. But still, Paul courageously makes the case that this is chewing up the church and shipwrecking the effectiveness of the church. It's causing a deep disunity and doing damage to individuals, to families, and to the whole effectiveness of the church's ability to serve other people and to reach people with the good news of the kingdom. Again, he points them back to the values of the gospel as the antidote for that. And then in part 3, we run into a really interesting situation that seems like a very foreign conundrum to us until you look a little bit closer and you're like, oh, no, actually, I think there are situations like that in society today as well. In Corinth, there were a whole bunch of Greek and Roman gods, and people would sacrifice meat to these gods, but then they were allowed to eat it afterwards. But there was a concern among the Christians. Some more Jewish Christians in this church were like, no, you can't eat food that's been sacrificed to an idol. It is done. That is participating in idolatry yourself if you do it. But then there were Corinthian Christians who were like, really? I mean, of all the things that are completely societally normative that we probably shouldn't worry about, this one, I mean, no one is looking at that and thinking that we believe in whatever God they sacrificed that food to at the barbecue at their house where they invite us over to just have food with them. Like if we're at a non-Christian's house and first they sacrifice their food or whatever, we can still eat it. That's fine. Well, Paul speaks into the situation and echoing the theme of shrewdness that is woven throughout all of Jesus' teaching in the Gospels. He's like, hey, if this is the kind of thing that even though you're free to do it, you do, and it causes big time damage to the church because you flaunt it or you're just generally careless about it, maybe you could restrict your freedoms on that voluntarily for the greater good so that we don't have to be constrained to making a whole bunch of rules to try to make this thing go. And maybe if your conscience really says don't eat that kind of food, You could not eat that kind of food, but you could also try to extend some kind of patience to people who don't share that same conviction of conscience. And so rather than writing a new rule, Paul articulates a gospel kingdom principle to give these Christians in Corinth a pathway to move forward. And I think this is a really interesting part of the book when you sit around and think about what it's like to live in a pluralistic society as a Christian today. There's stuff that is really screwed up that I have massive problems with. But if there isn't an obvious justice element, sometimes I look at that and I feel like, well, the shrewd thing to do is to just be patient with things that I really don't like and don't agree with. But there are Christians who feel differently about that than I do. And maybe there's some guidance when it comes to thinking through some of those public issues and social issues of the day in the thinking of Paul here in the middle of this letter to the church in Corinth. Well, apparently there was another problem in Corinth, and that was that the worship services were crazy. People had really latched on to how it felt in those early days when the miracles were popping and people could speak in foreign languages and there were prophecies like we see everywhere in the book of Acts or even in the Gospels. When the message of Jesus shows up, crazy stuff seems to happen, at least in the early going, maybe for even longer. But it made for worship services that were becoming scattered and unfocused, and that Paul charges were becoming a source of pride for people to demonstrate that they were the most Christian or that they could do the most Christian miraculous stuff. And he points again to the character of Jesus, the values of the kingdom, to say, no, there should be order in worship, and the whole thing should be about glorifying God, not glorifying yourself. Finally, there is apparently a philosophical question about the nature of the resurrection of the body. This makes sense given where Greek philosophy was at the time. But rather than diving all the way into all of that, Paul simply says Jesus was resurrected from the dead, and if we don't believe that resurrection is an actual thing, this whole deal is a joke. The whole letter I just wrote you is a joke. But then he goes on to say, but he has been raised. Look at this. And so here on this fifth controversy about the resurrection of the dead and what happens when people die, Paul just points to the main character of the entire religion, Jesus of Nazareth. And he's like, the reason you believe in him is because he came back from the dead. So yeah, resurrection has to be a thing. Now remember, 1 Corinthians is an occasional. Something happened, and Paul wrote to a specific group of people. So there's a ton more stuff that Paul thinks about more things, and he might even frame it, phrase it, or use an example a little differently if he were speaking on roughly the same subject matter, but to a slightly different group of people in a different town. But everything he does speak to here is kingdom Christian theology in response to the real circumstances of a real moment in a real church that Paul was very acquainted with firsthand. When you visualize the book of 1 Corinthians, picture the body of Christ, because that is what Paul is trying to nurture through the values of Jesus and the example of Jesus in the face of really ugly, sinful behavior that was damaging the church. When you think about the theme of 1 Corinthians, reflect on how gospel love informs everything. And finally, if you don't have time to read the whole thing, go catch chapter 13. But try to read it with fresh eyes and think of it in the larger context of what we're talking about here, and not just in the context of a cross stitch that your aunt might have given you for your wedding. All right, we've leveled up 1 Corinthians. We'll see about leveling up 2 Corinthians next time around. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.
This podcast is supported by many of you at patreon.com/the TMBH podcast. We're grateful because it supports our family.